Okay, this video is going to walk through the procedure for pulling the upper and lower chassis for a SVT Classic amplifier. I've already done the first step here, but step one is going to be to remove the screws that are located along here as a way to pull the back panel off. I like to also then remove the tubes just because it's nicer to have them out of the way to ensure that nothing's going to get broken during the disassembly. When you pull the power tubes, make sure to label them with some kind of indication of which tube socket they came from. It can be important to get these back in the same place, assuming everything is working properly so that you don't mess up the balance for the bias controls. So I like to just choose, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or some arrangement, label that, and then use painter's tape to label which tube goes to which point so it can go back into its original location when we're putting the amp back together. The next step is with the amp facing forward to remove these 4 screws and their associated washers. Since those washers are not attached to anything, you'll lose them if you just leave them attached to the chassis or stuck to the chassis. Okay, I actually couldn't get these guys out, but I guess just be mindful of the fact that they might come loose, so keep an eye out for them, or if you hear something rattle, mine are corroded into place, so not a big deal. Next step is going to be to pull this preamp board forward, and then we're going to remove this guy, this piece is just attached via Velcro, so we can just pull that forward once we get enough clearance there. Okay, so you'll kind of want the preamp board at an angle but still supported since there are wires attached there. And then we're going to disconnect the fan, which we can just barely see. They actually have some green tape on there on this one. That's not the case on all of them, but that's what we're trying to disconnect so that we can remove this front panel here. Okay, that piece kind of takes both hands, so I wasn't able to film it, but you'll hold this preamp chassis with one hand while disconnecting the fan and then pulling this section forward. Be a little careful. The Velcro can get a little stuck in there. But then we can completely remove this panel and then slide the preamp board back into place. And here's where things get fun, and I hope you've been lifting weights or exercising if you're working on one of these amps. We don't have to bolt this back in place, but we do now need to flip the entire amp over to get access to the screws that are on the bottom to release the bottom chassis. This is where we get into the point where it's easy to understand why some people don't like working on these. So you can see we now have the amp flipped over. The preamp board is at the front and on the bottom. Now on the bottom of the amp, we're actually on this amp missing 2 of the screws, but there should be 5 of these to remove to release the bottom chassis. This was a touring amp for a long time, so these got lost along the way, or otherwise were just left out to make it easier to service this amp on the road. So I'm going to remove those and then show you the next step. And just a heads up, it may be worth supporting the chassis as you're removing the last of those screws. There are points that will hold the chassis up here, but it will lean forward. I don't know if you can really see that from there, but the front end here will fall down a little bit on the power chassis if you just unbolt the screws from the top without supporting it otherwise. So before we can pull the power or the main chassis from the back, you need to make sure the preamp one is at an angle like this on the front side, since they are attached by those cables. So we need to be able to have this front panel chassis pull through the head shell as we are pulling that main lower chassis out from the back. So the official recommendation on how to do this is to use the transformers lifting from the bottom of this chassis to get it about halfway out like this, then to hold on to the chassis from the top here and here, to then pull this out as the other chassis from the front side is then sliding out, and try to basically move the two out together since they are attached to then slide out of the head shell. It is very heavy though, so be careful. Once you've slid both chassis out from the head shell enclosure, you should end up with something like this, with both chassis separate but connected via that wiring and tubing. Now I've already disconnected the main board here. The way that you're going to do that is to remove the nuts from these 2 points, as well as these 2 screws to the XLR connector, nut here, and then the 2 for the bias controls. At that point, you can disconnect these 2 ribbon connectors, as well as this one over here that's relatively short that goes between the other boards, and that connects to this point here. There will also be 3 screws on the PCB here, as well as zip ties if this hasn't been serviced before, or if the last person to do it kept those in place, clipping to the board at these holes and holding these wire bundles in place. And if you've made it this far, good luck. You're going to be ready to work on an SVT. Be safe. Make sure everything's discharged before doing this so you don't get shocked. These amps hold quite a large voltage charge, so make sure you're being safe. Also be careful when you're moving these things around and lifting it to reposition, because they are very, very heavy. All right, good luck. Thanks for watching. Hope you're all having a good day.